Good morning. Thank you all for coming. My name is Hank Greeley. I'll be your host today. This is the second part of a two-part meeting that is being held jointly with almost too many entities to remember. The first part was yesterday at San Francisco. How many of you were at the San Francisco portion? So about a third. And then we're finishing up today. Hosts for this conference include Hastings College of Law in San Francisco and UCSF. And then down at our end, the Stanford Center for Law and the Biosciences and the Stanford Center on Longevity. The goal in this is to talk about insights that neuroscience is bringing for our understanding of legal and social issues around human development. We cleverly decided to divide human development up into two extreme cases, youth and old age. And so yesterday, San Francisco got youth, and we got old age. We flipped for it, and I'm not going to tell you whether I won or I lost. But yesterday's program was about juveniles, children, what neuroscience can tell us about youth. And today we're talking about the other end of the spectrum, the one that I fear, with the occasional exception, is better represented in our audience than juveniles, aging. We've put together 3 different panels as well as a couple of standalone talks looking at different aspects of aging, neuroscience, law, and other issues. We'll start with you should all, by the way, have received a handout that tells you about the schedule, has the agenda. We'll start with a quick talk from Ken Smith about the demography of aging and just why it is such a huge issue socially in the United States and to some extent even more so in other countries. Then we'll go to our first panel, which will talk about decision-making and aging. The next panel will talk about financial fraud. One of the aspects of perhaps impaired or affected changed decision-making with aging is an increased susceptibility to financial fraud. At lunch, we'll have a lunch speaker, Laura Carstensen, who directs our Center on Longevity, talking more generally about aging, and we'll close with a session in the early afternoon on predicting Alzheimer's disease. Our increased ability to predict exactly who is going to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and what the medical, social, legal, and other implications of that kind of knowledge will be. We hope this will be a very interactive conference. We have relatively small panels and relatively short talks. Even in the panels, we're hoping, we have asked and are hoping that panelists will be brief in their comments and leave most of the time for discussion with the audience. This event is being live streamed, so if you do choose to talk, as I hope you will, be aware that every place on Earth and any place within range of our radio and television transmissions from Mars on out will arguably know for the entirety of the remainder of the life of the universe what it is you said. And we will ask audience members when speaking to come up and use these microphones, both to make sure that the Martians get a good, full rendition of what you've said, and so that everybody else in this room can as well. We are currently preparing and should have available in a couple of minutes a list with biographies of the various speakers in some depth, and we'll use that rather than give extensive introductions to any of the speakers. I do want to start, before starting with Ken, I want to make sure to thank the various people who made this possible, including all the people at Hastings and UCSF who worked so hard on this. We are, I think, the junior partners in this endeavor in that it was their idea, their initiative, and probably somewhere between 80 to 95% their work that put this conference together. And then at Stanford, I especially want to thank Laura Carstensen and the Center on Longevity, and especially Ken Smith, who has been absolutely crucial in making this happen, as well as the Stanford Law School's program group, led by Trish Gertridge. They're the ones responsible for the food, the rooms, and everything else that I hope will make this an enjoyable and convenient and effective. I don't know. I was sick yesterday, and I seem to be having some problems with word finding. A good, that's the word I'm looking for, a good experience for everybody. So, having said that, let's get started. And I'd like to bring Ken Smith up to talk about the demographics of aging.
You want to use this? Or?
I don't know. Do I need a microphone, or can you hear me?
You're loud here. I should use that.
Oh, you want me to use that? Okay. Does that sound about right?
Is it on?
Good question.
Green light, good.
We have no green light. I just have to find the switch.
It's on top.
There we go. How about now?
That's good.
Okay. And we'll go for the visual impact here. There we go. Okay, so with that out of the way, good morning. As Hank said, my name is Ken Smith. I work at the Stanford Center on Longevity. And what Hank asked me to do here this morning is to really set the stage for today and to talk a little, not about the what so much in terms of, how do people age. You're going to hear from the panelists. You're going to hear from Laura Carstensen, I'm sure, on how people age emotionally and socially. What I'm really all about is why should you care? I think if I'm successful today, you should have a sense of why looking at aging in this context and overall is something we should care about, because we are in, and I don't think I'm overstating it, an absolutely historic time in terms of how populations age. I sometimes find myself saying this in talks, and I feel like I'm overstating it, but we are entering realms of aging populations that have not been experienced essentially in human history. And so if I'm successful, I'll have you convinced about that by the time you leave, and you should know a little more about it. So let's start with the requisite population pyramid, as every demographic talk must begin. This is the population of the United States shown in 1950, 2010, and 2050. And if you're not familiar with population pyramids, I suspect everyone here is, but it's basically 5-year increments, men on the left, women on the right, with a median age in the middle there. And what you see in 1950 is why they call it a population pyramid. For most of history, I don't know which one of these I should be pointing to, these populations have been just that. They've been pyramids. A relatively large number of children, a good-sized number of middle-aged people, and a relatively small number of older people up on the top. So if you move forward to 2010, you see that pyramid now starts to look a little more like maybe a house. And when we talk about population aging, there certainly is a lot of credit that can be given to medicine and advances in terms of how long people live, what that top age is. But it's really not the main part of the story. The main part of the story is that children who are born, most all of them are growing up to become older individuals and to become, at this point, more of the middle-aged population, but eventually the older population as well. And I see Laura's walked in here, and I'm not sure how much I'll overlap with things you might say, but really, as much as this is about work that's been done on older people, this is about things around children and younger people. This is about immunizations, sanitation, really the fact that a child born today can really have a high expectation of becoming 60, 70, 80 years old. When we look at the projections out through 2050, those numbers become even bigger for the US. And actually the US stays, you'll see as I go forward here, in the world relatively young in this process because of some of the immigration policies we have and how those differ from the rest of the world. Now, if I think about this in terms of talking about youth and neuroscience yesterday and aging today, one of the other ways you can think about how the population is shifting is that as we go towards 2030, you can see this is the number of people over 65 and the number of people under 15, we actually start to enter a world where we have more older people than we do youth. And that's, again, something that's really been unprecedented anywhere. and so presents you know, a lot of changes, a lot of opportunity. I mean, this is really an amazing achievement that humankind has managed to come to this point where people that are born have this expectation of living to be old. And those gains are actually projected to continue. So if, again, this is life expectancy at birth, so you have to think about this as a baby being born and the expectation of how long they're going to live on the average. But in 2010, you can see the numbers around 80 years old, projected to continue to rise out towards 2050. This is, as I mentioned briefly, not just a US phenomenon. This is a map of the world, and if you can't see all the exact numbers down the bottom, you can essentially, red is young, and as you go towards lighter colors, those are older countries. And what you see is you probably can't see it as well, but Japan and South Korea and some of the Western European countries, Germany and Italy, are some of the oldest countries in the world, populations that have over 20% of their people over 65 years old. And you have the US, Russia, Australia, Canada, sort of the middle-aged countries, and then you see these very youthful countries through China, India, South America, and Africa. Now, when you fast forward to 2030, you can see that this aging phenomenon is really very global, and you can see some things changing around a little bit here. The US continues to age, not quite as fast as some of the rest of the world. The countries in Japan, Western Europe start to get really, really quite a lot older. And then in particular, I point out, as you look at Asia and especially China, China is aging much more quickly than most of the countries in the world. And I'll talk about that in just a second. And Africa and the Middle East continue to be very, very young. And as you've seen in the last year, if you've been watching any of the headlines, youth in the Middle East and Africa presents a lot of concerns, a lot of issues that can come up. We've seen the Arab Spring, which is very much a youth-driven movement. A lot of things tend to happen in youthful countries differently than they will happen in older countries. I'll talk just really briefly about China and India, since they're countries that pop up so often in our economic discussions. China is aging extremely rapidly, primarily, initially at least, because of the one-child policy, which was instituted in 1979. So you had, you can say all of these pyramids are a function of how long people live and how many children are born, fertility rates. So in China, what you see is in 1979, you had kind of a step change in fertility rates with the one-child policy, and you can see that relatively abrupt change start to bubble up through the population pyramid. Now also, you're starting to see fertility drops because they also tend to follow along with that become more developed, particularly women get more educated. That's sort of a natural progression of why fertility rates will drop, and you're seeing that now also coming out in China as we have a growing middle class and a growing economy. India, on the other hand, is a very different story. A little bit behind in terms of the aging. You can start to see that bulge move up, but even out into to 2030, it remains a relatively young country, and without some of the discontinuities that you might have seen in China. So you can make some assumptions about, for instance, economic activity as we go forward, and where manufacturing bases might move, where centers of youth are going to be. Now I want to move from sort of a global view to a more individual view. You often hear the phrase 60 is the new 70, or 70 is the new 60, or 60 is the new 70. Part of where that comes from is actually literally mortality risk and how much longer people can expect to live. So these lines are different levels of mortality risk. So this is age on the left-hand side, and then literally a person who is 50 years old has a 1% chance of dying, as on this line, 2% here, 4% here, and you can see the x-axis is time. And so if you take a look at, say, the 4% mortality risk, the person who is 75 now has essentially the same risk of dying as somebody who was 68 in 1970. So there's actually kind of a direct manifestation of the 70 is the new 60 in terms of literally risk of dying and expectation of living, I guess. I'm going to start with some thoughts about now how aging ties to the individual and how, I'm going to start with some of the good news here. And I hesitate because I've got one of the real world experts in the audience on this topic, but this is from the National Health Interview Survey, and it looks at people reporting psychological distress. So from a depression standpoint, and I don't want to use that in the clinical sense, but from people who are reporting psychological problems, those over 65 actually show a significantly lower instance than people who are younger. So the idea that people are getting old and depressed is not necessarily borne out in the data. So there's a good connection between good psychological health and aging. There's also been a lot of advances in recent years, or actually for a long period of time, with chronic diseases. This is a cause of death in the United States over time, and you can see that heart disease, while it remains the highest cause of death, has actually been on the decline for some number of years now. Similarly, stroke, cancer is kind of staying even there. And at the bottom, you'll see the one that is jumping up is Alzheimer's disease. And we'll talk about that as well. So as we move towards talking about dementia, think about it in the sense that people are living longer. We've done a great job with controlling quite a few acute diseases. We're starting to get a handle around some of the chronic diseases that have been traditional killers. And now people, as they are getting older, have a higher chance of getting dementia. So you have more people getting older. And the logical conclusion is dementia is now starting to come to the forefront as a larger and larger societal problem simply because more people are getting to the point where they're experiencing it. This is a slide from a recent report by the Alzheimer's Association, and it kind of bears out the same thoughts, that most other cause of deaths is going down. Alzheimer's disease is actually on the rise. Now, there's kind of a caveat here in that the numbers of people reported dying of Alzheimer's disease are going up partially because we have older people, partially because there's a greater awareness in the medical community of Alzheimer's disease. And so, for instance, things that are related to Alzheimer's disease, pneumonia in particular, is now sometimes being reported as cause of death being Alzheimer's. It's really related to the condition as well. So you're kind of seeing a double dip in terms of the jump you're seeing. Another slide, and this is also out of that same Alzheimer's report. There is a higher instance right now of Alzheimer's disease in Hispanic and African American people. Now it's interesting, this data was taken in New York City. This is Hispanics of primarily Caribbean descent. There's some differences in the data depending on where the Hispanic origin comes from. But there is some data that indicates that there is a higher prevalence in Hispanics and African Americans. And as most of you probably know, there is a higher number of Hispanics in the United States population, that percentage of the population is growing over time. So you can make some assumptions based on that. So when you put all that together, this is the projection of the number of dementia cases in the US, which is growing pretty drastically, looking up towards 11 million in 2050. So I think the main point I'm trying to make here is that these issues around aging are becoming issues that are really broader societal issues. And while I'm talking about dementia, I'm talking about Alzheimer's, that's not all the story. We're going to hear from a panel on decision making, and we can talk about things like financial fraud and whether people may or may not be more susceptible. We can talk about decisions that people need to make around retirement. There's a whole broad spectrum of things that go with aging and go with the aging mind. And I don't want to make this sound like this is all a pathological discussion around dementia or Alzheimer's disease. Although now that I say that, I put this last slide up here. And I just did want to say that in addition to the personal cost, there is certainly a very large societal cost. And this is back in 2005. It was estimated that the total cost of dementia was 148 billion to the economy. So in closing, I just wanted to kind of check back and see if I've actually accomplished my goal, which is to get people to understand that populations are aging rapidly in the developed world. On the whole, people actually are aging more in a healthy way and becoming more healthy. but that while the acute and chronic diseases are being controlled, it now makes the fastest growing part of our population those that are over 85 years old, and that Alzheimer's and dementias are on the rise. And there may be some issues with ethnicity trend that will make that perhaps even exacerbated a bit. I'm just going to close with one comment from my colleague Adele Hatton, and I have to first say that the majority of the work that went into these demography slides is Adele's. Adele runs the Global Aging Program in the Center on Longevity, is an economic demographer, and just does really wonderful work. And when she gives her talks, she likes to say that there are 4 major forces that have really been driving the global discussion in recent years. There is climate change, which I think everybody's heard about, the rise of technology and the progress of technology, globalization of the economy, and population aging. And while you hear about the first 3 very, very often in the news, really the population aging issue is growing and growing, and I think you can expect to hear it on the same level as those other discussions in the coming years. So with that, I'd like to close and take some questions if there are any.
I have one.
Okay.
And I hope I won't be the only. And I hope I won't be the only person with one.
If we had done those charts on population structures projecting into the future 10, 30, 50 years ago, my guess is they would have looked different. I'm wondering how much room there is for surprises or changes. And just as one example, to the extent we attribute the oddness of China's pyramid to the one-child policy, well, in 1975, the one-child policy isn't something you necessarily would have predicted as you were looking forward. So how confident can we be? Well, what does the past tell us about the extent to which changes in population structure will surprise us or may surprise us?
That's a good question. Well, so this is a difficult question to answer authoritatively because I think you're speculating sort of by the nature of the question. But certainly there are always those discontinuities that occur due to natural causes, right? I mean, I think it's impossible to predict hurricanes, floods, perhaps new diseases that we've never even heard of. I mean, when those 1970 charts came out, nobody'd heard of AIDS, I suspect, or very few people had heard of AIDS at that point. So certainly we could be surprised there. That said, on the top end of the pyramid, generally demographic predictions in sort of the world of science are considered to be higher confidence than an awful lot of other scientific predictions, simply because the people that are projected to be 85 years old 30 years from now are already 50 years old, right? So you have a higher expectation that those people are going to be around. Now, there is a fair amount of discussion, I think, around the projections of people continuing to live longer. There are those who are speculating that things like the obesity epidemic could, in fact, create a generation now in our younger generation that might be the first that's not going to live as long as their parents. Now, those, I think, are very much in discussion. I would not say that those are by any means high confidence, but there are definitely those kind of possibilities.
I mean, I agree with you that the projections for the elderly are probably pretty good because we do know who's 55 now, and we're not going to have more 85-year-olds in 30 years than we have 55-year-olds now. It's really the bottom end of the pyramid that I wonder about in terms of birth rates.
That's a good point.
My sense is, without having made a close study of it, that in the 50 or so years that I've been conscious and sentient, those projections have changed several times in terms of being lower, then being higher, then being lower. And to the extent you're worried about particularly some of the economic considerations, it's not just how many people are on top, but how many people are on top that make a big difference. Any sense of how much variability there is in birth rate projections? How much accuracy has been shown with long-term birth rate projections?
I can't say that I have that answer. I think if Adele were standing here, she'd probably have a better answer for you than I do on this. Now, I know that the the trend is that as societies become developed and become more educated, that birth rates tend to drop. As I think I mentioned before, as women in particular become more educated and become more able to control reproduction, historically you can sort of see birth rates dropping around the world as countries develop. And those kind of things I think you could attempt maybe to put some projection on if you make some assumptions around how economic development will occur. But, you know, policy changes, for instance, like the one policy law, cultural changes around whether people decide to have more kids or economics, I can't say that I can predict this. In fact, I know I can't.
You can predict them, you just can't be sure you're right.
Right. Well, I can predict all sorts of things. But.
Can I comment on that?
Laura, do you want to?
I have one more thing.
Please.
Laura, because the entire universe
Wants to hear what you have to say.
Yes.
I just want to tack something on that. I mean, there are a couple factors that people don't know about, and that's or can't predict as well. And one is immigration, and one is fertility. It does appear that immigration couldn't really make changes country by country because countries just can't absorb a sufficient number of immigrants to really change this kind of distribution. So that's probably not going to do it. But fertility is something that could change. The best bets are that it will go down in places in the world where fertility remains very high today, not that it's going to dramatically go up, because we haven't seen it go back up from low levels anywhere in particular. It could.
there are a couple European countries
There are.
that's edged up a bit.
There are, but not enough to probably turn around. I mean, they're trying to head off a decline in overall population size. It's unlikely, or this is what people think who are setting these policies, aren't seeing the kind of response to them that would suggest we're going to go back to a different population shape. So I think the biggest questions right now are, can Pakistan, can India get fertility down sufficiently low, Africa, to be able to age in the same way we're seeing around the developed world.
Thank you, Laura. Yes.
Hi, Ken.
And I may enlist you again since you're in the room. I have a greater authority here.
My question is with regards to these predictions that you're making, how do they take disruptive technologies into account? So you're not really, have an understanding of what's going to be coming up that's really going to help keep older people alive longer.
Well, I think by the nature of the name disruptive technologies, it makes it quite difficult, right? I mean, if you've read the Black Swan, right, that's exactly the discussion that the author makes there. And if those of you who haven't read that, it's a book, I think Nicholas Nassim Taleb, he talks about how predictions on the whole throughout history have always gone for a while, but then there's always the discontinuity. And it's called the Black Swan because animal science defines swans as being white until someone came across a black one in Australia. So it's the idea that everything changes. And I think I think you can't really predict those things. I mean, I think what you see up here are the predictions using a set of assumptions that are consistent with the world we know today. But for instance, if tomorrow somebody comes up with a cure for Alzheimer's disease, those numbers are going to change. And I don't know how to predict those. Laura, would you add anything to that?
Well, certainly if someone found a cure for Alzheimer's disease, we would see the dementia numbers change.
Right.
Life expectancy probably isn't going to change a lot because those are average, at least life expectancy, because those averages are not going to be affected so much by increasing life expectancy at 65 or 75 or 80. Even if there's some estimates that even if we found cures for all the diseases of old age, we would only increase life expectancy by maybe 10 years. Because there's still a cap, supposedly, on human mortality. So the big changes came from saving the lives of the youngest in the population. That was the biggest gain to increase the life expectancy.
And that's kind of a one-shot deal. I mean, you can only save the kids once.
Right.
So you're not going to see that level of change again in the future.
Hi there. So this is going to cost a lot, and particularly to the medical system, this is going to cost a lot. One possibility is that you would then start to limit resources at a certain age, and there is in the Obama healthcare initiatives the idea of starting to limit at they don't call them ages, it's 70 units. You are 70 units old. Limit your accessibility to, say, cranial surgery at over the age of 70, which if your graph is correct, that means over the age of 60. So that takes us to a system that's very similar to Great Britain. And I just wonder about the ramifications for that for Americans and how we see ourselves in the way that we've traditionally managed our healthcare and what your statistics might be predicting for how we need to economically manage this and how it might change our whole view.
Predict the future of the U.S. healthcare system. Thanks for the softball there.
I have just heard that within our community that there will be restrictions on certain operations over the age of 70, simply.
Well, I mean, that is the political discussion that's going on right now. I mean, I'm not going to try to venture to guess what the outcome of that political discussion will be, but if you do look at healthcare spending, a disproportionate amount of spending is in the last 2 to 3 years of life. And there's a lot of sort of heroic measures that might be done, and I think the discussion around whether that's the right thing to do from a societal perspective is certainly on the table. I don't know.
The idea of initiatives to actually just examine how healthcare in the last, over the age of 70, what are the, cost effectiveness of different measures might be an area that needs to be, carefully.
Well, and there certainly are people doing that. I mean, we have a great center on health policy at Stanford University. It also works on comparative health outcomes to try to come up with exactly those kind of measures. Yeah. And there are certainly, there's discussions around boards to determine, for instance, what procedures will be covered with Medicare. I mean, they've been sometimes coined the death panels. I don't think that was originally where they were.
Statistics are telling us that things are going to need to change somehow. Because we can't possibly afford that.
No, certainly if you look forward into the future and you look at all the things you could do with the deficit, I mean, and we've done some work in this area, that you could, cut all the defense, you could cut all the schools, you could cut everything. If you get out past, 2030 to 2040, you still can't fix the problem unless you do something about the growth rate of healthcare spending. I mean, that's not so much that, and I'm not saying that that even brings the healthcare spending down. It's just that the projections are that the increased rise in healthcare spending is so great, it's going to just overwhelm most other things in the budget.
Yes, thank you. I'm wondering if you were modeling also what would be happening with extreme weather changes, and we're always sort of bumping up about news about these epidemics that might hit that could wipe out large masses of population, 10, 15, 20 years from now, and how that might affect some of the policy planning. If you had a model and you could show how it would affect, the extreme fragile ends of our society if some kind of a strain of whatever pops through, and how that would affect how we're looking at our health choices and planning for the future there.
So, looking at, there's a lot in that question. So I'm just trying to think about what the right way to approach it is. I know that the interaction between, let's take global climate change and aging is really very interesting, because many of the countries that are projected to experience the greatest global climate changes are, in fact, the ones that have the very large growing young populations in Africa, in the Middle East. And there are people that are looking at projections on that. I certainly am not an authority on that, so I don't want to speculate. Laura, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, but I think it's a real, kind of wild. Pandemic, it's very hard. It takes enormous changes, enormous numbers of changes to affect the population distribution. I mean, we can have horrific diseases spread, and usually it doesn't affect it. World wars have not affected U.S. population or European population very much. So it just takes something hugely substantial. One effect on population, however, that has occurred over the last 100 years was the flu pandemic in 1918. And that did actually change population. It changed life expectancy, but it takes something really large to have that kind of absolutely possible, as we all know, and could have all sorts of effects worldwide. And I think what Ken is saying, that in all likelihood, I mean, pandemics will be worse in the poorest parts of the world. And those would be the parts of the world where there are the younger populations. So you could put together some sort of a forecast, but I haven't ever seen anything really hammered out in a very specific way. It's an interesting idea.
Thank you. I have a question about the demographics of depression. I love the result that as people age, perhaps they're becoming less depressed, but I wonder if we're relying on self-reporting to identify depression, because perhaps if someone has Alzheimer's or other dementias, they might not know that they're depressed, or it could be a depression that's developing over time and people get used to it and think that's normal, but if they were not depressed, they would be living much healthier, happier lives.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to kick this to you, Laura, but I'm standing here with one of the top experts in this area, so I really want to point at you.
Sorry, I keep intruding.
No, this is actually, I'm sorry. So by the way, this is, I'd like to introduce Laura Carstensen, the founding director of the Center on Longevity and the Farley Dickinson Professor of Psychology and Public Policy, if I've got that right off memory, at Stanford University. My boss, and really someone who is really world recognized in the area of how people age emotionally and socially. So it's hard for me to then say I can speculate on this better than you can.
The depression rates appear to be, the lower rates appear to be real. That is, and it's very hard to say that they're absolutely lower if you take into account the possibility that older people experience something like masked depression, where they're really not showing any sort of mood changes or physiological changes or any other kinds of changes. But as long as you use the criteria that are now used in the diagnostic manuals, it looks like you can look at this depression, sadness, negative affect experienced in everyday life, and the rates are lower among older people than younger people. So that's been looked at in lots and lots of different ways, and it does appear to be a stable, reliable. I'm sorry, I keep looking for you out here. I hadn't seen where you go. It does appear like that's a highly reliable finding. I'll talk a little bit about it later today.
Better hold on to that unless there's any more questions. Are we set?
Okay.
Thank you.